1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, and welcome to the Vininspo podcast with me, Ed Merrison. This is where wine is a travel experience. Join us as we pick up bits and pieces, make new friends, and create memories that make our future interactions with wine, people, and places all the more meaningful and fun. My guest on this week's podcast is Scott Wasley, founder and owner of Melbourne-based Iberian wine importer The Spanish Acquisition. Established in 2001 by this cerebral maverick writer, educator and all-round wine guy, TSA is a reference point for wines from the peninsula covering regions as diverse as Jerez, Alicante, Priorat, Rioja, Bierzo, Ribera Sacra, Douro, Dao, Alentejo, Madeira and more. We talked about the moment a bunch of bar keys torpedoed a PhD and unlocked a future in booze, fat-assed Volvos, murder ballads and movers and shakers in Madrid, the Renaissance rehistoricization and repositioning of Spanish wine, rejecting the bullshitocracy and seeking sincerity, the reign of Spain's red head honcho and the toppling of Tempranillo, repaying the generosity of the Invitation Nation, long lamb lunches in Ribera del Duero, making inroads into Italy's multi-microcultural monopoly, why tapas and raciones are a recipe for alegría, the captivating chiaroscuro of Goya's black paintings and La Goya's pale manzanilla, an unreserved revulsion of run-of-the-mill reserva, and why wine is romantic as cuss and conveying it to others is the greatest joy. I started by asking what life was like when Senor Wasley was just a chiquitín.
I grew up in the west coast of South Australia, little country towns. My father was a primary school or originally area school headmaster. So he started out teaching sometimes one teacher classrooms, a bit like Wake in Fright, where he'd have grades 1 through 7, including one classroom that had my eventual mother in it. So we had 20 years in country towns and so on, and eventually I moved to Adelaide City to go to uni and start doing grown-up stuff.
Were you a precocious child?
I was a fair bit of an introvert, but I also kind of wanted to be out there, so I had to learn to get the inside out, and sometimes that led to inappropriate experimentation or over-egging the pudding, or however you want to put it. So balancing overt and inverted was sort of a large process of my younger life.
Right. Any creativity in bringing out that inner extrovert? Did you get up to any drama or music?
I wrote a little bit of stuff and whatever, but the introvert still won at that stage. So I never went as far as learning the electric guitar or becoming a drummer or a painter or something like that. So I dabbled, and reading and writing ended up being my way out.
So I take it you were pretty studious. What did you study?
Well, after the usual high school stuff, I went and did a general arts degree at Adelaide Uni. Lots of geography, social studies, eventually got an interest in Marxist critiques of the contemporary capitalism economy and all of that sort of thing. So I had a lifelong sort of social justice and environmental interest at a political level.
Yeah, I was going to ask, do you know what kind of piqued that in the first place?
Yeah, the absolute bullshitocracy under Paul Keating, who later on became sort of a hero to me. But, in the early days, he just sort of turns around the corner and starts bleating out all of this market theory. And I'm in my early 20s and going, he's basically neo-Christian. It's just, like Sermon from the Mount stuff. Certitudes that, he inherited from somebody in the government economistic stream at some point and then regurgitated them in, 1983, 1984, when the Australian so-called left took a fairly market economy approach to progressivism. And I didn't get the certainty of the economic theory, the view from Treasury. So I started reading a lot about it because I couldn't complain about it unless I had valid arguments to unpick it. And the economic credentials of that era Labor government, the Hawke-Keating years from 1983 to 1996, had a degree of environmental underpinning on them, but they were extremely pragmatically established, so we say. The government actually started in 82, and by 83 it was in trouble, and they went, oh, we need something. And this absolute grub from Queensland, who was in the government at the time, called Graham Richardson, who had no beliefs in anything except power, came up with the idea that there was this fracas going on down in Tassie that they could pick up on, which was the protests against the damming of the Franklin Below River Gordon. And in a very quick moment of study, they decided that they could come up with an environmental argument that had them on the side of this, and they actually pole vaulted themselves back into the lead and became not a one-year government but a 14-year one, thanks to a very, very convenient flirtation with environmentalism that I thought could have been a little bit more serious than that in the long term.
Yeah, right. So you had a bit of an issue with, I suppose, the certainties that you thought might have been wrong, but it sounds like you had a bit of a problem with the lack of sincerity as well.
Yeah.
Which I asked because I suppose it's probably come into a little bit the conviction behind your indie trading to this day. But anyway, what happened next in terms of your studies and where your career might have been shaping up then later on?
I spent about 15 years in and out of work and study. So I was at uni for parts of about 16 years and in and out of various bits of the workforce that were pretty much entirely something to do with booze. So wine shops originally just as a day labourer worker, stack the shelves, ka-ching things at the till in a busy drive-through. Later on running a independent Adelaide Hills, I was going to say bodega, but wine shop. Then I went back to do postgrad studies and was lucky enough to graduate to working on the floor in restaurants, and pretty much started that part of my career, for want of a better word, with the opening of Michael Hillsmith's Universal Wine Bar in Adelaide.
Which I guess was pretty ahead of its time in terms of how well attuned it was to drinking interesting wine.
Absolutely, but almost immediately became an international hub. So, within months there was, some version of Neil Perry or Jancis Robinson or those sorts of people, sort of tootling through to have dinner on their way to, meetings in the Barossa or something like that. And it served a really good spotlight function for Adelaide that, it could be part of a valid, bright international network or system. It wasn't just, a place somewhere on a colonial map.
And were you extroverted enough at this stage to strike up conversations with the winemakers or the journalists or whoever was passing through?
Yeah, I was going all right by then.
Okay, so what happened next? And what
besides behind the bar, we had unofficial access to large bottles of Tanqueray, which of course lubricates lots of things. So.
And what happened then to bring you from Adelaide to Melbourne?
So I'd been spending a fair bit of time finishing a PhD and in the daytime doing some lecturing, mainly tutoring at Adelaide Uni and getting ready to be baby politics professor Scott, but still working in the restaurant at night and literally tossing coins about which side of the coin that would be my head I wanted to land upright. And I moved to Melbourne to clarify things and just go, I'm going to finish my PhD and become a politics professor on my way to my end goal, which was actually to be a op-ed writer, public intellectual. On the way, I was coming to Melbourne to just simplify things, have a little, 3 or 4 night a week shift supervisor job with no management responsibilities, which ended up, after trialling at 2 or 3 places, ended up at a place that no longer exists in Fitzroy Street in St Kilda called Bar Corvina, which later on became 2 or 3 different venues in Andrew McConnell's group. And I'm not certain what's there now, but Bar Corvina was a cute little local wine bar. And the owner, Michael Kennedy, liked my style and certainly liked my background at the Universal and whatever. And so I'd done a week or 2 of trialling, and he said, "So, Scotty, what are you going to do?" We're sitting down at this wooden table in the middle of the restaurant. And I said, the plan is to, just work here, maybe 4 nights as a shift supervisor, lock the doors, see you later, no further involvement, and get up reasonably sober the next morning and finish writing my PhD and go off into the academic wilderness. And Michael picked up this big, heavy owner-manager keyring thing that he had with 80 keys on it or something. And he just said, and he just let go of the key ring, or you could do whatever you like with Bar Corvina and let go of the keys. And I reached out and caught them before they hit the table and went home and deleted my PhD in progress and committed to hospo for the rest of my life in that funny moment.
Yeah, that's quite a turn of events. And so what was St Kilda like then? What kind of Melbourne did you stumble across when you came in the late 90s?
Melbourne at St Kilda at that time was at the pretty unfortunate point of about to be sanitised out of existence. So when I moved there, it was not uncommon for me walking down Fitzroy Street to see Roland S. Howard stumbling across Fitzroy Street on his way to somewhere. The great connection with punk and other types of creative energy. At that stage, a couple of very good restaurants and an extremely vibrant wine scene at the George Hotel, which was just down the road from where I started working. It was exactly at the time that mass scale gentrification just came and wiped the place clean to less than interesting results overall.
Yeah, we're talking about the bar scene and general hospitality scene in an episode with Patrick Walsh from Cellarhand, talking about actually quite an interesting time for people working in bars. The kind of term sommelier probably wasn't really bandied around that much, but at the same time, it was an emergence, I feel, of people rubbing shoulders who had quite a lot of creative energy, a lot of energy in the hospitality scene in general. Did you feed off that? Did you see potential to really make something exciting of Bar Corvina / any bar opportunities that might have come your way?
Yeah, I did. Firstly, I had really good experience in Adelaide at the Universal and a wonderful mentor in Duncan Miller, the long-term manager there, who was both an extremely funny, extremely smart and extremely thirsty human being, and ratbag lefty like myself and whatever, and Michael Hill-Smith's influence from above and all of that sort of thing. So, I knew a lot about what was going on within the limits of what was available in Australia. I should just deviate for a second. Also important to remember at that time in Melbourne, the very late 90s, Melbourne CBD itself was almost a no-go zone. Not exactly, an LA ghetto with, barbed wire or something like that, but very few people lived in the city, and it wasn't where people went to recreate. Particularly, it wasn't where you went for headline dining and wining. So late 1990s, there was Walter's Wine Bar and a couple of things, sort of places that uni students would go to. But the volume of, restaurants and bars and the volume of Melbourne's dining spend that takes place within the Melbourne CBD these days is, a thousand-fold increase in 25 years.
Yes, and you obviously had good access to wines while you were at the Universal and a good upbringing there in terms of worldliness, I suppose. But what about Spanish wine? What was that in Melbourne in the late 90s when you arrived in St Kilda?
Well, it was a giant question mark in your brain, really. I'd had some exposure to sherry at the Universal, which resonated with me. My notional family home was in Springton in the Barossa Valley, and one of the great events I was aware of was the annual sherry party in Springton, where all of the old Barossa folk would, go out to schlook on sweet brown stuff for the night, and it all sounded very, sort of mysterious and otherworldly, and of course, charming and compelling and all of that sort of thing. So by the time I started working in wine shops, and particularly at the Universal, the sherry bit of the wine list was of particular interest. Not interesting enough because sherry was still legal as a term in Australian winemaking, Seppelts and many, many other people. But the sherry that was coming into Australia was a pretty limited range, and it wasn't well shipped. It was quite often out of date and all of that sort of thing. But I kind of loved it anyway because it was out there compared to, a glass of Shiraz or a glass of Riesling. And then in Melbourne, so when I got to Melbourne, the same limited stuff was available. And as I started to take an interest in Spanish wine ahead of a trip that I was planning, I went out and tried everything that was available, which was not very much, and not much of it was really of interest at all. There might have been 8 Spanish wines available, and most of them were supermarket or co-op, and literally nothing that I'd want to drink now.
All right, you just mentioned a trip that you went on then. How did that giant question mark then turn into the beginnings of an answer? How did that come about?
So, with a dear friend, Peter, who was in the wine game, restaurant sommelier, He was actually a trained sommelier. I've been self-trained in everything all along. So Peter was part of the early branchings of Sommeliers Australia. And so we decided we were going to go in 2000 on a European wine trip. And he said, where should we go? And I said, well, we're drinking some stale insert brand name Fino right now. Why don't we go to Spain so we can check out what Fino tastes like when it's fresh in Jerez? And he said, that's a great idea. And we had a couple of years, and I'm a university trained researcher, so got on it and started to read and whatever. Had a lucky encounter with Max Allen, who said, "Oh, Spain, Scotty, that's interesting. I don't really know much about it either, but I met this interesting guy at a tasting in London a few weeks ago called Telmo Rodriguez. I think he makes wine in somewhere called Ribera del Duero." And that was about the first week that I was starting to learn how to do the, www Google search sort of thing. And somehow I found Telmo, and that was back in the day when he was still actually answering his own emails and whatever. He said, sure, young Australian blind person, come and visit. So we had Telmo, and then by various means, I managed to find out some names of other people that might be out there. And when I came across an interesting name and got in touch with them, I said, anybody else you can recommend? I went in with a frame already. I said, I'm not interested in anybody who's trying to make Parker points, and I'm not interested in anything that's just old-fashioned, cheap fruit, oxidizey, oaky, blah, blah. I want wines that speak of where they come from. So just, terroir expressions, moderate middle ground wines in between extract and oxidization is what I'm after. And all the people that I contacted were more than delighted to go, oh, yeah, you should try this, this, and this, which ended up leading me on, Hansel and Gretel fashion breadcrumb to meet the network of people who were the emerging face of great, authentic historical wine in Spain as the Spanish wine renaissance was playing out in the later 1990s.
I suppose Spain at the time was not that long out of an extremely depressed era of Franco's regime, and what passed for modernity, I suppose, was EU cash going into very globalized bland wines. And so there wasn't really a resource, I suppose, for actually finding out what those things in between those extremes were of the very old-fashioned and the quote-unquote modern, i.e. globalized, internationalized wines. So it's that grapevine, isn't it? So tell me a little bit about the trip and the connections that you made on that first run.
Yeah, so I'd found a few people. So there was a really nice English woman, the deep English connections in the sherry wine trade in Jerez and Sanlúcar and so on. So there's a really nice English woman called Jane Ward, who was sort of ambassador for Lustauer, who were imported here by negociants. And they were more than happy to give me her contact details. So I had a Jerez appointment. So I went, okay, well, that's sherry sorted. We'll find out what else is going on when we get down there. But, we've got somebody to have lunch and a visit with, and they can show us which way is north and where the Atlantic is, and we'll figure it out from there. Hopefully we get lucky and meet some other producers. And that was kind of the model. So I had 2 or 3 contacts in Priorat. So we started the loop in Barcelona, went down to Priorat. We had Telmo, this guy who makes wine in Ribera del Duero, which turned out to be the least important thing of what he did. But I'd stumbled on the threads of truth that Telmo was far more than Ribera, thankfully, the day before our appointment with him, and didn't seem like a complete dummy. We went up to Rioja. We went over to the Douro Valley and then down to Jerez with significant time in Barcelona and Madrid because, you got to eat and drink sometime. The starting trip was in Montsant and Priorat, and I had found out about Capsanis, and I'd found out about Sara Perez, and I had an appointment with a guy who had a business that was going to fail shortly. A sad story. I won't name names or go into it, but that was a winery in a hot season. So we're there in harvest or pre-harvest in September 2000. It's a very hot year. And it was really telling. We went into some bodegas that literally were heat and vinegar, and you could just smell how off the wines were before they even became wines. And you went into other places that were cool and lovely and either good historical or good contemporary practices in vineyard and bodega and stuff were in play. And you could see that it was just a country on the cusp of rediscovering its past, embracing modernity where it was productive and appropriate, but getting out of this 40-year slump post-Franco that had bedeviled everything. And in Priorat, we were handed around like party toys. Hey, we got these 2 guys. They're all right. They've only got 2 appointments. Do you want to have one? So this is maybe the best producer in the region. Well, best producer in the region who wasn't Alvaro Palacios going, oh, you need to meet the other best producers in the region. And they'd, over lunch that they'd just invited you to after the 1-hour appointment that you had booked to taste at the winery. Oh, you guys are okay. Let's go tramping around vineyards. And then at 4 o'clock, we'll go out for lunch and we've got a party at our place tonight. Maybe you want to come. Now, what are you doing tomorrow? And they literally just get on the phone and ring the other 2 or 3 best people in the region and share us around.
Yeah, and Priorat Montsant itself, I mean, a pretty extreme place to start the trip in terms of that incredible scenery. But did the wines blow your mind?
Hardly at all. Sarah's were good. A couple of others were good. It took us until a little bit later on this trip to taste anything of Alvaro's. But 90% of what was made then was hot-grown, late-picked, highly extracted, oxidatively handled, chucked in, fairly impactful and oxy-enhancing oak and, degrees of rancio and all of that sort of thing. And they were nearly all big wines, big wines, and, not just big fruit, but oak extract and, oxidative influences and all of that sort of thing, kind of like bad dry port.
Yeah, right. So that probably set, in a way, the tone for the table wines that you encountered, in that you saw chinks of light for that modernity and still this coming out into the light, I suppose, from those times. What were the other experiences like, other regions that you went to on that trip?
Well, the next one was meeting Telmo in Ribera del Duero, and we got taken out for lunch. I know a lot about lunch in Spain. Lunch in Spain's one of only 2 or 3 conversations about food that I ever really want to have. It's just amazing. So there are 4 restaurants in Ribera del Duero that specialize in local lamb, and it's unbelievable. You go out to eat lamb. If you're hungry for dessert, you have lamb chops after you've eaten the whole lamb. You get a haircut salad. That's about it. The lamb is delicious like no other lamb on the planet. It's young, very slow cooked. So when you're driving around in the towns in central Spain, you see signs saying pizza cooked in a lamb oven, as opposed to how we do it here, something or other cooked in a pizza oven. So they're slow baked. You can't get into a restaurant. You have to have made a booking the day before because they'll take however many lambs they've got butchered and need for that day's baking. 5 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, they go into the oven with water, a bit of salt, and maybe a pinch of herbs and nothing. And then they start coming out of the oven at 2 p.m., which is early for lunch. They pull them out of the oven. You're having a quarto of lamb for your booking of 3. So they'll cut the lamb in quarter, take that quarto, and then they'll get a side plate, and they just butcher the lamb with a side plate like this. It's so soft and slowly cooked. Tong it into a ceramic bowl, chuck it on the plate, and then you get the one great gastronomic lesson that is to be learned here, which is the nutty and soft deep tannins of Ribera del Duero Tinto Fino are the only thing in the world that will actually rinse your mouth clean of lamb fat in this circumstance. And you can actually eat a lot more lamb and drink a lot more Tinto Fino than you think is conceivably possible. And when you finish at 5, you've got about 5 hours of walking around to digest before you have a little anise and say goodnight.
Very good. And what was your impression of Telmo?
Telmo was probably Telmo before there was a Telmo. He's just this timeless, very determined human being who's both ruthless and fastidious in terms of what the story is, or the story according to Telmo. And the story according to Telmo is, without fail, the deeply historical story of what is actually good for this region, what is delicious about this variety, and how we should go about it. And then over the years, he's become a great benefactor to many other people. And, one of the great things about Telmo and Alvaro and these leaders of the whole country has a renaissance wine scene is that they don't take the glory and the coin and the laureates and all of that sort of thing and put them in a cupboard. They turn around and share with the community and bring other growers up, bring the towns up, not just their winery.
I gather there was a bit of a fateful lunch that you had in Madrid once you got back.
Yeah, so we said goodbye to Telmo in Ribera del Duero, which was a small project within his broader ambition at that time, and it remains one, albeit he's done a truckload of work there over many, many years. He just produces one wine and a little commercial thing that's not really part of the story. So he said, "Are you going to Rioja?" And I said, "Yeah, of course." And he said, "I'm from Rioja." And I said, "Well, kind of, but I don't really know enough about it." And he said, "Well, I do have my own Rioja project, but I'm from Remayuri, which is, probably the great estate of Rioja. Do you speak Spanish? No. Do you speak French? Sort of. All right, I'll arrange a meeting for you. Can you be there day after tomorrow? Sure." Because the plan was, have one appointment in a region or two appointments and lots of space and see what hookups we get and clues and, drinking this nice bottle of wine on Tuesday night, ask the wine waiter how we get in contact with the winery because we don't speak Spanish, so could you make us an appointment tomorrow or something, was the plan. So Telmo made me this appointment with a young French Basque winemaker, so Basque Spanish-speaking, but with a heavily Basque French accent. And we went and had an amazing 4 or 5 hour visit with her and a couple of other nice things in Rioja before Telmo finished saying goodbye. And he said, "Are you coming to Madrid at all?" And I said, "Of course, we'll be there, blah, blah." And he said, "Oh, give me a ring, we'll go out for a beer." And I said, "Sure. Have a beer with you anytime." So we went off and did Rioja and then out to Portugal and back to Madrid and gave Telmo a ring and said, "We're arriving in Madrid today." And he said, "Oh, let's have a beer tomorrow afternoon." So we went and he said, "Here's my address." So we rock up at his address in very fancy Salamanca and there's lots of beautiful art. And there's this guy sitting down on the couch talking to Telmo, who turns out to be the head sommelier of El Bulli. Telmo said, "Anyway, head sommelier of El Bulli, off you go. I've got these Australians I need to talk to and taking them out for a beer." So I kicked out the head som of El Bulli, and Peter and I trundled down the street with Telmo and ended up having a stubby of manzanilla and some prawns and had a little chat. And he said, "So what are your plans tomorrow?" And I said, "I really want to go back to the Prado and revisit the Goya black paintings and check out Velázquez a little bit more deeply." "It's a good plan. Can you do that in the morning?" I said, "Sure." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, I was thinking of taking you to lunch at this really nice restaurant at the time, La Broche, it was called, was probably the top joint in Madrid." And he said, "Where are you staying?" Mentioned this little pension in the middle of the old town. He said, yeah, I know it. Walk out, turn right, walk up to the end of the street. There'll be this big fat ass old Volvo at the end of the street. Get in it, we'll go to lunch." Peter and I walk out, turn right, up to the end of the street, and there's this big fat-assed old yellow Volvo with the windows down, blasting out Nick Cave's murder ballads, at least going up to 11. And just bright enough to figure that might be my ride. And I stuck my head in and said, "Hi, I'm Scott from Australia. Sorry, I don't speak any Spanish." The guy put his hand out and said, "Hi, I'm Peter from Copenhagen. Get in." It was Peter Sissek, who was by then already of Pingus fame, and he drove us to the restaurant, and we had to wait a little while before the third member of the party out. Telmo had rung Alvaro Palacios and Peter Sissek, the three, high-end gods of Spanish winemaking, as it became the thing that it was becoming, and said, "Hey, there's these couple of interesting Australian cats. I thought we could take them to lunch at La Broche and show them a few nice bottles." So we had lunch with Alvaro Palacios, Peter Sissek and Telmo Rodriguez, and that sort of became near enough to a cornerstone of producers that I wanted to work with, and the network began from there.
Okay, and from that point, were those conversations edging towards the idea that you might be their importer, or are these just connections that might lead somewhere between you in wine?
This is just like people who love books meeting at a writer's conference or something like that. You don't know if they're an editor, a publisher, a reader, an actual writer, a wannabe writer, or anything like that. You're just united by the love of words and story and all of that sort of thing. And this was how it was then. That was the circumstance. We were something to do with wine in Australia. Theoretically, I was about to open Bar Scotty, my version of the ultimate wine bar in Melbourne, albeit on a sort of indie low budget kind of basis, not hoity-toity or big fit out or anything like that. But it was going to take me a couple of years to get my head around what that meant and all of that sort of thing. So I was just there as an informed wine tourist. But basically just as a gastronome. And Spaniards love, well, they're unbelievably hospitable people. It's very hard to generalize about people and nations and all of that sort of thing, and usually foolish to do so. But they just love being able to welcome people, show them their part of the world, the food that comes from here, the traditional stuff. And we were, just accepted and shouted. So I learnt the most important term in my, by now very slowly, rapidly increasing Spanish vocabulary. On the first trip, I learnt the meaning of the term "I invite you," which doesn't mean, "Hey, Ed, I invite you to meet me for a beer at the Standard next time you're up in Melbourne." It means, "I invite you to meet me for a beer at the Standard, and the beer's on me, mate." So go with these people. It's like, okay, they're showing you a $50 bottle of wine or $500 bottle of wine or whatever it is, and they take you to a bar or something, and you pull out your wallet to pay for the chorizo or whatever you might have had in the bar to wash down this nice bottle of wine that somebody was kind enough to share with you. And they go, no, I invite you. Your money is no good here. Which very happily reciprocated when we've had people out here from Spain and send them for appointments or whatever, and go, "You've got to invite them, do it properly." It's just a wholehearted, deeply natural, nothing affected about it at all. It is just the way they want to be, inviters.
Yes. And so now back in Australia then, after that trip, with all those heady experiences of being invited to several things and shouted several times over, what happened to Bar Scotty?
Bar Scotty got shot into a pretend basket on the wall, rolled up piece of paper kind of thing, a little after I got back. At first I got back bemused because, I had no stash of my own, but I had this piece of paper of all of the things that I'd written down. I went, "Oh, what would that look like as a wine list?" At first I wrote it as if I could write a wine list of Spanish wine in Australia, how deep would it run? How good would it look? What would the prices be like? Et cetera, et cetera. And I looked at this thing of all of the people I'd met and the wines and the regions and great varieties and styles, and I went, pretty damn good. I spoke to a mate of mine who was a very interested observer in what I was doing, and he said, "What are you going to do with that, Scotty?" And I said, "Well, I think all I can do is just, put it together as an idea for somebody to buy into their wholesale imports business." Back then, imported wine was handled by 3 big companies in the main. The whole indie scene of, at that time, me, Patrick Walsh, Ewan Mackay, Steve Norton, Tremont and Taylor were already up and about by then, but they were the first people sort of not out of these big companies. And then the next wave of us came along. I went, "I'll probably go to one of the big companies and go, 'You're a bit lazy. You should know about this yourself. But I found all this out. How about I, for a consultancy fee for a year or so, give you a hand to buy in a Spanish portfolio, and, I can go around and do the knowledge for you.'" My notional introversion had pretty much worn out by then. So I was very, very happy, speaking in public about these things and all of that sort of jazz. So that was the plan, and the plan got stopped. The second Peter in my story said to me, "Well, that's all very interesting, but not really what you want to do, is it?" And I said, "Well, no, I'd rather, sort of have my hands on it and control it and do it right." And he said, "Well, why don't you?" And I said, "Well, you know the answer to that. I have zero money." And he said, "I'm sure you've costed out what it might take to make a little start." And I said, "Yeah, I've done a spreadsheet and the number's $58,154 or something like that." And he said, "Well, I got 60 grand I can afford to lose. It'd be really good fun to see what you get up to and watch your journey." And we both slept on it for a day, and the next day we did the handshake, and I went and wrote to a number of these people and started with 80 cases from Telmo. And when they were on the water, I went, "Well, that's kind of a joke. I'll need some more wine from Telmo, because by the time they get here, if there's any future in this, they'll be sold. So I better buy some more, and I'd better start with Capsanas and Sara Perez and a couple of others as well." So I put a second little batch of wine on the water, which the negotiants were very kind to allow me to co-ship in their containers. So I did 2 partial containers in other people's boats before I started doing FCLs, full container loads of my own, all reefer from the get-go, of course. I was gifted some money that I was allowed to lose and jumped in the very deep end and held my breath for a couple of years or so, and we were sort of away.
Yeah, so thus the Spanish Acquisition was born. Great name. Of course, we love a pun on the Vininspo podcast. But was it ever going to be another name?
It started out another name. I didn't actually think I was going to be a wine importer. The Spanish Acquisition was going to be a subset of my idea of being an independent wine academic in the Australian trade. So I came up with a business name called Wine Guys. Going back to your original question, I never called myself a sommelier. I just said I'm the wine guy here. So the wine guys and gals, I could do a collaborative project with you one day, a collaborative project with somebody else another day. I could do this, that, or the other thing, and it'll all fit under the rubric of wine guys, including wedging the Spanish project in there somewhere. So I got myself a casual job in a restaurant because I needed to at least guarantee the rent, and set out as an independent with a wine writing job, with a small business consulting to restaurants about anything to do with their restaurant, including food and service and design, but particularly their wine lists. I wrote my own wine education course called Sweet Like a Lemon, which I then promoted and taught and whatever a couple of nights a week to small classes, and put this first batch of Spanish wine on the water. So Scott Wasley Wine Guy was, 4 different ideas, with Friday sort of being this, passion project about strange but beautiful nations wines that I'd just discovered and which nobody else had any clue about.
So, well, I won't lie, Spanish Acquisition is a better name than Wine Guys. But also we also had Matt Paul from General Taylor on the show, and Patrick Walsh, as I mentioned, just talking about the experience of being on restaurant floors. Like you say, you played lots of different roles in that hospitality sphere. You understood how it worked from all sides. That must have been really important in seeing what you could bring to people when you're bringing those wines into the country, how they are applicable to the local scene. But at the same time, I'm assuming that you had quite a long way to go in showing people quite how diverse and exciting Spain was at the time.
Well, yeah, we joined 2 ideas there. So firstly, you mentioned a little bit about with a decent background in all aspects of hospitality. If you speak the local language, it makes you a better tourist, right? So I could walk into any hospitality restaurant, bar, whatever setting, and know what they were talking about, what their needs were, because I'd been in and around all of the things. So even although you might be meeting me today as there's this guy, Scott, who's a authority or an emergent authority on Spanish wine, I knew everything about their businesses and all of that sort of thing, because I've been involved in lots of them in different ways, as you said. How you link in, though, is a completely different thing. So if you're Matt Paul and his long-term boss, Michael Trembath, you've got, 3,000 Italian restaurants in Australia. 2,800 of them are probably pretty bad at what they do, but it's technically pretty easy to flog Italian wine in Australia because there's shitloads of Italian restaurants. For me, it's the reverse. I've got the lesser-known country that I'm working with and virtually no idea of or no representation of what Spanish cuisine might comprise of and their different local styles and things, or just how to eat Spanish. It remains a problem for me. Lucky Matt's still got his, 3,000 or 4,000 Italian restaurants to sell to. I'd possibly have 20 or something nationwide, which, absolutely flummoxes me, because Spain, in a way, has led or been a co-leader in massively changing how we eat in Australia, from families going out and dad ordering his entree, main and dessert, and everybody else ordering theirs, and maybe you got to put a fork out and taste some of his steak if you were having lamb or something. So nowadays, I can't remember the last time I went to a restaurant in Australia and ordered my own plate of food. We all eat share plates and little plates, so all of the stuff that comes out of the language of tapas and raciones and all of that sort of thing is how we eat in Australia nowadays. That's co-generative from Japanese eating culture and Mexican eating culture. They're very, very similar things, including the mix of hot and cold and raw and cooked and all of that sort of jazz. But it hasn't actually cashed out into all that many or all that big of a Spanish eating scene in Australia. Those that we have are really outstanding. But I promise all listeners, there is nothing in the world like going to eat in Spain. We do need to have France in existence because just once in a while you do need to go and eat some vegetables and salad, and that's what France is there for. But apart from that, if you can't be in Japan or Mexico, Spain is the business, particularly if you like simple, historical, rustic, authentic things that aren't done anywhere else, and they just charm the pants off you.
Yeah, I love it. From a point of view then of, if you didn't have an in, I suppose, so easily in terms of awareness of Spanish culture or Spanish cuisine, how did you find that traction build with your customers in terms of the interest in Spanish wine and their knowledge of it, their enthusiasm about it, how you recruited, I suppose, cheerleaders for Spanish wine? What's that timeline been like?
Well, it was slow and it was a push, but when you're starting and you're little, you just need 2 good sales a week, and you need 2 new clients a week, and grow a little, learn a little, and don't forget, the early days. I wasn't representing Spain. I had, here's 8 ideas out of Spain, eight producers from 8 different regions. That's a big upgrade in what we know about Spain. I'll go and learn 30 more ideas in the next 5 years, little by little, step by step. But this is enough to talk about to start with. So Australia and I kind of grew together in terms of how I unfolded the place in my head and got deep on new regions and new varieties and ideas and stuff, and then brought them back. So the great answer is that not all restaurants in Australia are culturally parochial. It's not just Italian restaurants or French restaurants, and therefore I'm fucked because there's no Spanish restaurants. So back then, Patrick Walsh was still running Langton's in Melbourne, and that was, a great international wine list, a great international restaurant that just served really, really good food and believed in really, really good booze. Probably a bit French focused, but if you could convince them that it was interesting and they wanted to drink it, it'd go on the wine list. You draw a line down that to 20 years down the track, and one of the great Italian dining institutions in Australia, Grossi Florentino, very Italian, fantastic Barolo list, and would have made many thousands of dollars for Trevor Taylor and all of that sort of thing. They always had a Spanish section from, pretty much from the get-go. Guy and people later on working under Guy wanted to be internationalists, not just parochialists. So, good restaurants with interesting wine lists was the only thing I ever went looking for, because it was kind of all I could eat for.
Yeah, and that timeline I speak of, I feel like it was perhaps a decade ago, I might be wrong, that all of a sudden people were going from Australia to Barcelona and to San Sebastian. Mostly those 2 places, not necessarily further afield from Australia. It's hard for people perhaps in the UK to imagine, just because all of those places are so accessible. But it feels like there was a little bit of a shift in how a lot of that Italian focus had been allowed to encompass Spain. Is that something that you've seen as well, that suddenly that interest in the doors that you can open have just become a little bit wider?
Yeah, well, in terms of interacting with people, not necessarily directly related to my business, but people who are interested in going to Spain. And I've always taken a very Spanish, facilitative, hospitable view of that and go, I've got a spreadsheet, I've got a list, you're welcome to it. You're going to be putting money in my friends' pockets and, buffing up this place that I love. So you're right, it's blossomed over the years, possibly as the booze story has helped things blossom, but so lots of people go to Galicia. That's got as much to do with awareness of the Camino de Santiago as it does with maybe they've tried some Albarino or something like that. I think the first 10 years ago or so, Barcelona had more of a focus. Nowadays, for me, my strongest focus is on Madrid, which I think could be considered the eating capital of the world almost, and an extremely charming place to walk around and not as throttled by tourist throngs and stuff. Barcelona's pretty hard work, although they're taking great steps to unpick that at the moment.
And in terms of wines that you import and sell, wines that have become more popular over time, I'm assuming that that's almost reflected this broader interest in Spain and Spain's variety over time. What have you seen sort of shift from what you're importing in the first days? I'm assuming that the awareness was that a lot of Spanish wine was Tempranillo, therefore that was Spanish wine. What about now?
Yeah, look, it's probably almost a dad joke by now, but I'm a dad, so whatever. There is no such thing as Spanish wine. If I said, hey, Ed, come over to my place to drink some French wine tomorrow night, the first thing you go is, what's he talking about? Champagne, Cornas, Peperone, what are we going to have? But back in the day, it was kind of a cliche. So a lot of people's cliche view of Spain hasn't changed much, and it's pretty backpacker. Tempranillo, bulls, red potatoes bravas, that sort of low-rent imagination of what Spain can be. But it's true that when I started, pretty much the idea was Tempranillo, etc. Tempranillo, and yes, it'd be nice to sell a bit of Garnacho. Tempranillo, sure, somebody might want to have a bit of Cava, somebody might dabble in a bit of Fino or PX, but that was about it. In the early 2000s, it's conceivable that there was nobody in Madrid who'd ever drunk an Albarino. In 2001, it was certain that there was nobody in Madrid who'd ever drunk a bottle of Mencía, because the Mencía industry didn't exist. And this is not new Spain. This is old Spain being reposited, rehistoricized. So Galicia, all of the regions of Spain absolutely lost their well-being and their ability to do local well. After Franco, the countryside was poor, and what they needed to do was retreat into co-ops and grow the easiest kilos they could. You can't be a Medio Pepe making improbably great wines from local grape varieties because you've got outstanding genetics, a great vineyard, hard work ethic, clear vision, etc., etc. You just had to make kilos. And it was grandparents and grandchildren. To use a term of Alvaro Palacios's, the countryside was a demographic desert. All of the intelligent young to middle went to the cities or mines or armies to get better paying work than flogging it around in a farm that had no possibility of a viable economy. So in Galicia, where I was speaking before, they just simply abandoned local grapes and the poor hill slopes that grow the best vines and stuff, and they turned the fertile river valley soils of all of Galicia into a giant paddock of Palomino, which grows grapes as big as my head, and that's about as dumb and easy a kilo of fruit as you can vinify from, full stop. So the Galician wine industry didn't exist as a commercial thing outside of servicing its own local regional interests. It wasn't exported. It wasn't in Madrid. So when Alvaro and Ricardo rebirthed Mencía from about 2000 on, and this grape variety started to become known in Spain and then internationally, it was the first flowering of what becomes an enormous renaissance, which is regional varieties and historical styles, historical understandings of where and how to plant and to prune. And this is happening in Jerez with Palomino just as much as anything else. So there's been this, say, starting from 1990, 35-year deep dive in the well of small, local, confident people going, let's make what we used to be great again. And interest-wise, it's about 1 over 100 of how interesting Marga is. It's exactly the reverse, real intellectual curiosity for what had been great and how to bring it back and how to do it right, not necessarily adopting this trellis methodology or this French oak idea or whatever, just going, what happened here 100 years ago? What happened here 50 years ago? Let's find out, let's play, because whoever was doing it here 100 years ago had been doing it for 500 years and probably worked out fairly good ways of doing it. So we can put all of that long spiel in a nutshell. If Spain in 2000 was Tempranillo, etc., this past year, the Spanish acquisitions, sales breakdown, Tempranillo was 19%. Of what we've sold. So it's now the little tail that doesn't actually do the work of wagging the body of the dog all that much. 50% of what we sell goes out of a fridge. Fizz, white, pink, vermouth, Fino, 50% out of the fridge, not even red wine. It's changed an unbelievable amount.
Yeah, well, General Franco, not really a huge cheerleader of regional diversity or self-determination, which obviously had a major impact on those regions. But the same can't be said for you. You've done an awful lot to bring that diversity to Australia. What is it that you enjoy about sharing those relationships that you have with the Spanish and your joy of traveling there and being shown that culture?
It's very simple. It's, if I pretend to be a country-born person first and, love of dirt, love of hills, love of trees and interest in what's unique or beautiful about the Eden Valley or Hunter Valley or whatever, which I'd already explored a lot in Australia, just travelling around Spain and seeing how physically different and beautiful and very often tough. These are not easy, beautiful paddocks to just, pick Parker points from. A lot of it is quite dour. Pretty much every region, although they might be notionally conceived of as Spanish, people in Priorat are incredibly different cats to the ones in Rioja or down in Jerez. So there's a deeply ingrained culture of the person that comes out of the land and the history. Each of them have incredibly different soil profiles and regional grape varietal specialties and food recipes. So you put all of this together, you go, if I go to Jerez, I'll be speaking Spanish in a certain way, with people who look at the world in a certain way, eating a certain type of food, drinking a certain kind of wine, all of which is based on a certain terroir that's like nowhere else in the fucking world. And Jerez is so damn specific but then you change again in Alicante and in Valencia and in Priorat and on and on and on. And, we haven't even touched on Asturias and broader parts of Basque and Galician Spain, let alone much in Portugal. So there are dozens of worlds where all of the strands that you want, which is language, humour, behavioural tropes and ethics and personal styles, plus food, plus booze, plus terroir, scenery, how you hang out, are you in the mountains or near the sea, and all of those sorts of things. Every one of them is just this incredibly complex, completely separate world unto themselves. So my Spanish wine world is just 20 or 30 worlds within that I get to play in and get to, study and read about and learn deeply in, and it's just endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, and when you caught that falling bunch of keys in Barcelona all those years ago, turning your back on a life of academia, you didn't exactly turn your back on a life of teaching, though, did you? Because that's really a role that you still relish, I would imagine, going to groups and showing them new stuff and engaging with their curiosity and these things that you've got so much out of.
Yeah, whether it's speaking to the broader public or in industry, in training sessions or whatever, my greatest joy is just helping people understand what it's like to stand on this hill in Valdeorras and for some reason having the heckles of your neck up and a certain song blaring out of your head that's connecting you to this vista and this unbelievably pretty glass of wine that you're drinking and going, holy fuck, I need to find a way to convey what it's like to stand on this hill, because that's why this glass of beautiful wine tastes exactly like it does. And, A, there's a lot of facts. B, there's a lot of, good wine and geological, et cetera, factology that I've learnt. So it's, helped me become a much more rounded, wine intellect and all of that sort of thing. But then it's just romantic as all cuss. You can take all of these good facts and the fact that you know the place and try and take people there without actually being able to get on a plane and take them there. And it's a hell of a challenge to be in an imagined community, that hill in Valdeorras or something. But the closer you get, the better it is, and it's a lot of fun to try.
And speaking of romance, does Leah normally go on these trips, and how does she feel about your madcap adventures in Iberia?
She feels good about them as long as she gets to go on the trips. And we've of late also been doing our own wines. So these are a pair of wines that are our ideas. So Leah's an artist. These are drawings of Leah's with my handwriting on them. So we've got a couple of wines that we've actually conceived of from scratch and enacted all the way through to their graphic identities and stuff. And they sell really well in the Australian market. And we're extremely proud of them, and we can't do that unless we're in Spain together. So since we've been together nearly 20 years, there'd probably be 3 or 4 trips that I've been on for one reason or another with a group of wine tourists, or just quickly going over for one little research project. But she's probably been on 20 of them with me.
Yeah, cool. Did she share your love of Goya?
La Goya or Goya?
Goya.
Leah's an enormous Goya fan. So, yes, there's never a Madrid trip that doesn't have a long and solemn walk around the room with the black paintings in them.
Now, the day after we have this conversation, aka tomorrow, you are, I'm assuming, going to attend a sherry tasting at the Prince Wine Store, one of Melbourne's foremost wine retailers. What kind of crowd are you going to encounter in terms of their awareness of what you sell, and how has that sort of changed over the journey?
Well, tastings at the Prince are interesting. A, they pull a significant crowd all the time. And B, there's a circling group who are very, very, very regulars at these tastings. So, I probably do, 4 or 5 of these tastings for the Prince a year, which means I've probably done, 100 or 150 of them or something over the years. So a lot of these people I've actually served and spoken to, quite a number of times. But, there's no doubt that the awareness of Spain in gastronomy is a lot broader and deeper, thanks to everything that a lot of us have been doing over a long period of time, including just the mental opening up of the Australian gastronomic mind. And it's, at least a reasonably educated, or at least open and interested.
Yes. And of course, I hadn't really thought about it before, but Bellota, the restaurant next door, of course, with a little bit of a Spanish influence in the name.
Absolutely. And one of my favourite little diners in Australia. Great food, nice little room. One of the legends of Australian chefing in my book, Nicky Reimer, and terrific place, and very, very European.
That's right. I say, last question. There are lots of different options, of course, that you could have. This was speaking on a Friday. I'm sure that you've probably got something relatively nice lined up tonight. But just to give us a contemporary snapshot of what finger on the pulse Spanish wine, or Spanish and Portuguese wine, I should say, importer Scott Wasley is thinking of drinking on a Friday night, what might be a good option in, I don't know, in maybe the fizz, the white and the red sphere right now that is cutting edge from the Spanish world?
The fizz for me is always Reventos y Blanc, almost without doubt the best fizz producer in Spain. Produces a distinctly non-champagne style of Spanish fizz, which I absolutely love. I adore champagne and drink a lot of it, but I don't want or need my Spanish fizz to be aping champagne. We are, 800 kilometres south of Champagne. So we're in a totally different climatology, still chalky soils, but great varieties that find fruit and acid balance in a completely different way to Chardonnay and Pinot. I don't think it would be interesting to mimic Champagne down in Penedès, nor would it be sensible. So there's this more open apple and earth, very easy style that's, sort of has less glyceric richness, less dosage and all of that sort of thing. Delightful drinking style at, half the price of quality equivalent in Champagne. We drink a reasonable amount of Spanish fizz as well as Champagne and some Aussie. And I do like the English gear. But the best thing about Reventos Blanc is the story. It's run by a crazy cat who's one of the geniuses of the Spanish scene, Pepe Reventos. Under Pepe's father, about 12 years ago, Reventos Blanc withdrew from Dio Cava. Back in the day, 90% of the Cava was made by 3 companies who make pretty ordinary wine. So 90% of Cava was under aspirational and, not necessarily environmentally progressive or anything like that. And Reventos y Blanc said, all right, we're going to get permission from the EU to create a sparkling wine appellation called Arnoia, named after the valley of the river Arnoia, and we'll invite growers from this valley to join in with us to make place-specific, high-quality local fizz that's, organic, method Chapman-wise, blah, blah, blah. 12, 13 years down the track, there is still exactly one producer in Dio Arnoia. White for me would be definitively Palomino from Marco de Jerez. I think it's the greatest recovery story in all of this recovery that Spain's been doing to extract the notion of Palomino as a shit workhorse from incredibly under-aspirational industrial phenos none of which would be named, to find that we can make this William Ramiro's La Riva single vineyard Vino de Pasto Palomino retail around about $300, directly in contest with Coast-Jury and the other great white wines of the world. 15 years ago, you could make $2 total cost of production Fino in this region and nothing else. And in 15 years of conviction about how great their vineyards are, how great Palomino can be and how great the wines can be, and recovering the historical styles that had been forgotten or eliminated, they put this place on the map as one of the great white wine situations in the world, completely not reinvented themselves, but rehistoricized themselves in 15 years. And the wine is unbelievably delicious. The most savory white wines in the world, but with lots of chalky, fresh energy underneath. And with red, it's a flower day today, so we could kind of go anywhere. But more and more often, Leah and I drink the recovered varieties of the Mediterranean, which, if you think about Mediterranean red wine, maybe you go, Mediterranean's kind of warm, so their wines would be sort of big and stocky, and they probably, have some extract, and we chuck some oak at them and all of that sort of thing. They're actually all of these Renaissance varieties. So I'm going to say, for tonight's sake, going to have a Mando local grape variety in Valencia from Silla del Rure, and this is a wine that's balanced, white tannins, lovely herbal characters at 12% ABV, delicate, chillable on a warm day. You just drink it at 17, 18 degrees on a cold Melbourne night like this. The great story of Spain's change in the last 15 years has been just exactly this, all of these locally adapted varieties coming out that handled well, really great with food, and a high level of drinkability. Bebible, stuff that's highly concentrated fruit and plenty of toasty oak and all of that sort of thing. Might get you points in a magazine or something like that. Might look good in a tasting lineup or whatever. I question whether that's necessarily always actually drinkability. And, I got a funny little brain that really likes to look at wine very, very closely. The one day I need to get to know it and understand it inside out. And after that, I really just like drinking it. And I don't want to think too much. I want it to be muy bebible.
So 25-ish years into the Spanish acquisition then, still very happy to get high on your own supply.
Absolutely.
That's it for this week's podcast. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and share it everywhere. Please don't underestimate the power of these endorsements in making it possible to produce original, thoughtful work. You can also subscribe to my Substack. That's edmerison.substack.com. For now, I'd like to say thank you to Lucas James for the music, Neil Williams for the artwork, Patricio Garcia for additional editing, and to my guest, Scott Wasley. Till next time, live wine to the fullest. Cheers.